My name is Edward Lawson. I am 68 years old, and the day my own son-in-law threw me down the attic stairs, I truly believed I was going to die. I want you to understand something before I tell you this story. I am not a man who dramatizes. I am not a man who exaggerates. For more than 3 decades, I sat on a bench in a courtroom and listened to testimony from people in the worst moments of their lives. I learned to separate emotion from fact. I learned to weigh truth against performance. I know the difference between real pain and theater. What I am about to tell you is not theater. Every word of it is real. Every bruise was real. Every crack that echoed through that stairwell, real. Every tear that rolled down my face as I lay broken at the bottom of those stairs, every single one of them was real. And the rage I felt, that was the most real thing of all. But before I continue with my narration, I would like you to hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comment where you're watching from. That afternoon, a Tuesday, grey and cold, the kind of afternoon that feels like the world has given up. Everything I thought I knew about my family collapsed in a single moment of violence, so sudden, so savage, that my body couldn't process it fast enough to protect itself. He confronted me at the top of the attic stairs. His name is Daniel Carr. He stood in the doorway with his jaw tight and his eyes full of something I'd never seen directed at me before. Not irritation, not disrespect, not the usual cold shoulder he'd been perfecting for 2 years. This was something older and uglier than all of that. This was hatred, pure, unfiltered, contemptuous hatred, the kind that doesn't care who gets hurt. "Get out of my house, you worthless old man," he roared. His voice shook the walls, and his face, Lord, his face was twisted into something that didn't look entirely human anymore. I had seen that expression before, in courtrooms, on men being escorted to prison in handcuffs, men who had already decided they had nothing left to lose. I raised my hands. I opened my mouth to speak. I thought, foolishly, naively, that we could still talk, that there was still some version of this moment that ended with words instead of broken bones. I was wrong. Before I could even steady myself, his hands slammed into my chest. The world vanished beneath my feet. I want you to understand what it means to fall down a flight of wooden stairs at 68 years old. It is not a movie fall. There is no slow motion. There is no graceful tumbling. There is only chaos, violent, merciless, unforgiving chaos. My body hit the first step with a force that drove the air out of my lungs in a single brutal gasp. Then the second step caught my spine. Then the third caught my shoulder. Then my head hit the railing on the fourth step down, and the whole world exploded into white. Each step slammed into me like a separate punishment, like each one had its own grievance with me, like the stairs themselves had decided to take his side. I heard something crack. To this day, I don't know if it was the stairs or my bones. In that moment, it didn't matter. In that moment, all I knew was pain, a white, roaring, all-consuming pain that started somewhere in my chest and spread outward until it filled every corner of my body. My ribs, my spine, my skull, my left hip, my wrist. I must have reached out for something, some railing, some last handhold on a world that was done holding me up, and the wrist bent at an angle it was never designed to bend. I landed at the bottom. I lay there broken, unable to breathe. For several seconds, maybe longer, time had lost all meaning. I genuinely could not tell if I was going to survive. The pain was so enormous it felt abstract, like a weather system passing through me. I tried to pull air into my lungs and my body refused. My hands were shaking. My vision was grey at the edges and getting darker. And then I heard footsteps on the stairs above me. I thought, God help me, I actually thought that he was coming down to help, that some part of him had been shocked back to sanity by what he'd done, that the crash of my body on those stairs had broken through whatever madness had possessed him, and he was coming down to kneel beside me and say, I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. But it wasn't Daniel who appeared in the doorway above me. It was my daughter. Her name is Charlotte. She is 41 years old. She has her mother's eyes, warm brown eyes that I used to watch light up when she was a little girl discovering something wonderful about the world. Eyes that I sat beside for 2 hours in a hospital room, holding her tiny hand the day she was born. She looked down at me from the top of those stairs. She looked at me lying there broken and gasping on the floor of her hallway. And then she said 4 words that destroyed something inside me that I don't think will ever fully heal. "Leave him there," she said coldly. "No one cares." She turned away, and she was gone. And I want to tell you, I need you to understand that tears filled my eyes in that moment. Not from the pain, not from the physical agony radiating through every inch of my body, not from the fear of what might be broken and how badly. Those things were there, yes, but the tears that came were not from any of that. They came from the realization that I meant nothing to them, not to him, and not to her. That after everything, after every sacrifice I had made, every dollar I had given, every moment of love and patience and support, I was lying on their floor and my own child had just told someone to leave me there. I had no idea a human being could feel so completely alone while still being alive. My vision blurred. The gray at the edges of my sight was closing in. I could feel my body beginning to shut down, not from drama, not from performance, but from actual physical trauma. My breathing was shallow and wrong. My left side felt like it had been filled with broken glass. The wrist I'd thrown out to catch myself was throbbing with a deep, bone-level pain that told me something was seriously wrong. But somewhere in the back of my mind, somewhere beneath the pain and the grief and the profound, devastating shock, something else was awake, something disciplined, something that had spent 32 years in a courtroom and knew that what happened next mattered more than what had just happened. With the last strength I had left, I reached into my pocket. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely grip the phone. My vision kept swimming in and out, but I found the number. I had always kept it there, not because I ever thought I'd need it in a moment like this, but because some part of me that had spent a career around violence and danger understood that you never truly know when everything changes. I dialed. The phone rang twice. A voice answered. I told them who I was. I told them what had happened. I told them the address. My voice was barely above a whisper, but I got it all out, every word, because I had spent 32 years learning how to deliver facts under pressure. And even lying broken on a hallway floor, I was still a judge. I was still Edward Lawson, and I still knew how to make a record. I hung up, I closed my eyes. The pain was enormous. But for the first time since his hands hit my chest, I felt something that wasn't fear. Minutes later, sirens screamed outside. And when the officers rushed in and saw me lying there on that floor, when they saw the blood, the angle of my wrist, the way I was holding my ribs, the gray in my face, their expressions changed. They turned to my son-in-law, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms crossed and his jaw set like a man who thought this was still somehow recoverable. And they shouted, "You did what?" But before I tell you what happened next, before I tell you about the look on Daniel Carr's face when those officers turned to him, before I tell you about the phone calls that were made and the records that were pulled and the slow, merciless machinery of justice that he had just set into motion against himself, I need you to understand something. I need you to understand what I saw in those officers' eyes. Because it wasn't just professional outrage. It wasn't just the routine anger of law enforcement responding to an assault. What I saw in their eyes when they walked through that door and saw me on that floor was something more specific than that. More personal, more dangerous for Daniel Carr. They recognized me. And the moment they did, the entire temperature of that hallway changed. My name is Edward Lawson. I am 68 years old. I am a retired Superior Court judge. Let me say that again, because it matters. Because it matters in the way that a locked door matters when someone is trying to break through it. And because it matters in the way that a name on a case file matters when that case is about you. I am a retired Superior Court judge. For over 32 years, I presided over some of the most serious criminal cases in this state. I sat on that bench and I heard it all. Assault, aggravated battery, manslaughter, murder. I heard testimony from victims and defendants, from expert witnesses and character witnesses, from crying families in the gallery and stone-faced prosecutors at the lectern. I watched men try to lie to me, and I watched the truth come out regardless. I watched justice work, slowly, imperfectly, stubbornly, the way it always does when the people operating it are committed to it. I want to tell you what 32 years on that bench actually means, because I think people have an abstract relationship to what it means to be a judge. They think of the robe, the gavel, the raised bench. They think of a figure of authority in a formal setting, and all of that is real. But what 32 years on the bench actually means, in practical terms, is this: you become fluent in humanity's worst moments. You see people at the point where all their choices have narrowed to their consequences. You develop an understanding of how violence works, how cruelty works, how the self-justifications that allow people to do terrible things to each other are constructed and maintained. And you develop, above all things, a clarity about cause and effect, about actions and their consequences that is extremely difficult to deceive. You also build relationships, serious, lasting relationships with the people who operate the machinery of justice alongside you, the prosecutors who argued before me for years and whose careers I watched develop, the defense attorneys who respected the fairness of my rulings even when they didn't win, the law enforcement officers who appeared in my courtroom and who understood, from how I ran my courtroom, what kind of man they were dealing with, the clerks and the court reporters and the bailiffs who saw me every day for years and who knew me not as the formal figure behind the bench, but as the man who brought homemade coffee, cake to the clerk's office every year on the anniversary of the court's founding, and who asked after their children by name. Those relationships, that network, that is what 32 years means in practical terms. I put violent men behind bars. I upheld justice when the justice system was under pressure to bend. I protected the innocent when the innocent didn't have anyone else standing between them and the worst outcomes of their lives. I was fair. I was rigorous. I was, above all things, consistent. And I never, not once in 32 years, abused the position I held. I never used the power of that bench for anything other than its intended purpose. But power doesn't disappear when you leave a job. Experience doesn't evaporate when you hand in your robes. And the relationships built over 32 years of presiding over serious criminal cases in this state, the prosecutors who had argued before me, the defense attorneys who respected me even when they didn't agree with my rulings, the officers who had sat in my courtroom and watched me demand integrity from every person who appeared before me, those relationships don't retire when you do. Daniel Carr knew I was a retired judge. He had been told this. It had come up at family dinners. Charlotte had mentioned it to him before they even started dating seriously because she was proud of what her father did. He had sat across from me at my dining room table and called me sir and asked me about cases I'd presided over, and I had answered him patiently and with warmth because I thought he was genuinely curious and because I thought he was a genuinely good young man who loved my daughter. But somewhere along the way, in the years after they married, Daniel Carr had decided that a retired judge was just an old man, that the title was historical, that the respect was ceremonial, that the power was past tense. He had decided that I was just a burden taking up space in his house. To him, I was just an old man in the way. That was his first mistake. It was, as it turned out, the mistake that ruined his life. I need to tell you about Charlotte's mother. I need to tell you about Miriam, because nothing about who I am or who Charlotte became or why any of this matters can be understood without understanding who Miriam was. Miriam Lawson died 11 years ago. Pancreatic cancer, which is a cruel and fast disease that doesn't give you enough time to make proper peace with anything. We had 39 years together, 39 years of a marriage that wasn't always easy, but was always real, always committed, always the bedrock of everything we built. 39 years is long enough to see a person in every version of themselves, the hopeful young version, the exhausted middle version, the wise and settled version that comes in the later years when you've both stopped pretending and started being entirely real with each other. I knew Miriam in all of those versions. She knew me in all of mine. And what I know, standing on this side of her absence, is that you cannot replace that kind of knowledge. You cannot find another person who holds that much of your history in their hands. When Miriam died, she took with her entire years of my life that exist now only in my own memory, with no one left to share them with. That is a particular kind of loneliness that I don't know how to explain to someone who hasn't lived it. She was the most generous person I have ever known. Not generous in the way that people say as a platitude at funerals, she would give you the shirt off her back, but genuinely, structurally generous. She organized her life around giving to others. She taught school for 28 years. She tutored kids in the evenings for free. She organized food drives at our church every Thanksgiving for 2 decades. She visited her elderly neighbors and brought them food and sat with them when they were lonely. She remembered birthdays that other people forgot. She made soup when people were sick and stayed until she was sure they had eaten it. She was the person that other people called when the world had dealt them something they couldn't carry alone, and she always picked up the phone. And she raised Charlotte. She raised her to be curious and compassionate and strong. She raised her to ask good questions and to stand up for people who needed standing up for. She told Charlotte, when Charlotte was about 14 years old and going through a particularly difficult stretch, that the truest test of a person's character isn't how they treat people who have power over them, it's how they treat people who don't. I know Miriam told her this because Charlotte repeated it to me years later. At a dinner I remember clearly, a summer evening, windows open, the smell of something good on the stove, and she said it the way people say things that have settled deep into them and become part of how they see the world. She believed it. At 29, sitting across from me at that dinner, she believed it completely. I watched my daughter fail that test in the most devastating way a father can witness. After Miriam died, Charlotte was all I had left. That's not a figure of speech. I had colleagues, I had friends from the bench, I had neighbors I liked and could talk to, but the person who filled the center of my life, the person who made the house feel inhabited and alive, that was gone. And the only remaining piece of Miriam that walked the earth was our daughter. I threw myself into being present for Charlotte. Whatever she needed, I was there. When she was finishing her graduate degree and money was tight, I helped. When she was in a difficult period professionally and needed someone to talk things through with, I was on the phone. When she and Daniel first got together and she was nervous about whether it was serious, I listened. When they got engaged, I gave them my blessing, genuinely, warmly, with real happiness in my heart. When they got married, I danced with my daughter at the reception and I told her that her mother would have been so proud. And I meant it. I meant every word of it. I paid for a significant portion of their wedding. That's not something I say to hold over anyone. I say it because context matters, and because the story of what Daniel Carr decided I was worth requires the full picture of what I had actually contributed to his life. In the first years of their marriage, they struggled. That's normal. Establishing a life together is genuinely hard, and Daniel was in the middle of a career transition that had left them in a financially difficult position. They were falling behind on their mortgage. Charlotte called me one evening, her voice careful and tight in the way it got when she was trying not to ask for something she felt embarrassed to need. I drove to the bank the next morning. I gave them enough to cover the mortgage arrears and have some buffer. I told Daniel that it was a gift, not a loan. I told him that because I didn't want any kind of financial obligation sitting between us, creating awkwardness or resentment. I wanted it clean. I wanted it to be an act of love, not a transaction. I thought it had been received that way. I was wrong. I was wrong about so many things. I should have seen it earlier. The signs were there. But love, particularly the love of a parent for a child, has a powerful capacity for willful blindness. You don't want to see the thing that would require you to make an impossible choice, so you don't see it. You explain it away. You give the benefit of the doubt so many times that the doubt accumulates into a mountain you can no longer ignore, but by then, it's very late. Daniel was charming at first. Genuinely charming, easy laugh, good stories, the kind of man who makes a room feel larger and warmer just by being in it. He was respectful when we first met. He called me sir without being told to. He asked about my career with what seemed like genuine curiosity. He was attentive to Charlotte in ways that made me feel that she was genuinely loved and cared for. But over time, gradually, the way water finds its way through stone, his mask began to slip. It wasn't a single moment. I want to be clear about that because a single moment would have been easier to address. A single moment of disrespect can be corrected. A single flash of cruelty can be excused as a bad day, a moment of stress, a lapse in someone who is fundamentally good. What Daniel showed me was not a single moment. It was a sustained reveal, a slow unpacking of who he actually was once the performance of good behavior was no longer required. He became cold, not dramatically cold, not cold in a way that Charlotte would have found alarming if I'd tried to describe it to her, because descriptions require precision, and what Daniel did was imprecise and deniable. He became cold in the way that someone can be cold without ever doing anything you could definitively point to. The tone, the pauses before answering. The way he would look through me sometimes, like I was a piece of furniture that had been there so long it had stopped registering as a presence. He became disrespectful, not with profanity, not at first, but with dismissal, with the kind of disrespect that operates entirely in subtext. The interrupted sentences, the rolled eyes when he thought I wasn't watching, the way he would address questions I'd raised in conversation to Charlotte, as if I hadn't actually spoken, as if my words had needed to be routed through a younger person before they could be acknowledged. He became entitled. This was perhaps the thing that disturbed me most, because entitlement toward me was the clearest indicator of how completely he had revised the story of our relationship in his own mind. He had accepted a great deal from me. He had accepted financial help. He had accepted my presence in his life. And somewhere along the way, he had reclassified all of it, rewritten the history so that none of it was generosity, so that none of it had been a choice. He acted as though what I had given him was something that had simply happened to him, like weather, as though it didn't imply any corresponding obligation. He spoke to me like I was a burden, not the man who helped build his life, not the father of the woman he had married, not the person who had given them money when they were drowning, just an inconvenience, just an old man who took up space and had opinions and wouldn't disappear. And Charlotte, who had her mother's eyes, Charlotte, who I had danced with at her reception, Charlotte, who I had driven to the hospital in the middle of the night when she was 7 years old with a terrible fever and held her hand through all of it, Charlotte said nothing. She watched, she allowed it. And slowly, I realized that she had allowed it so many times that allowing it had become her position. She had abdicated. Somewhere between the woman her mother had raised and the woman standing in that doorway, Charlotte had decided that keeping the peace with Daniel was more important than protecting her father's dignity. And slowly, and then all at once, I realized I was no longer welcome. In the home I had helped provide. I had moved in with them 8 months before. My choice, initially prompted by a health scare that turned out to be less serious than feared, but which had revealed to all of us, including me, that living alone at my age in a large house was not as sustainable as I'd been telling myself. Charlotte had suggested it. She'd insisted on it. She'd called me 3 times in 1 week to urge me to consider it seriously. "You shouldn't be alone, Dad," she'd said. "We have the room, it makes sense." I had resisted at first. My entire adult life, I had valued my independence. I had my books, my routines, my garden that I'd tended for 20 years, my neighbors who waved at me in the mornings. Giving up the house felt like giving up something essential. But Charlotte was persuasive, and I was honest enough with myself to know that she had a point. I was 68 years old. The house was too large. The stairs were increasingly difficult on bad mornings, and Charlotte was my daughter, my only remaining family, and the idea of being closer to her, of having dinner together in the evenings, of watching my grandchildren grow up at close range, of not being so entirely alone, that idea had its appeal. I won't pretend otherwise. I agreed. I sold most of my furniture. I packed my books and my clothes and the photographs I couldn't leave behind, and I moved into the guest room on the 2nd floor of their house. Within 2 weeks, Daniel Carr had made his feelings about this arrangement clear. Not directly, not in words I could have quoted back to him, but in the architecture of daily life, in the way meals were arranged and not arranged, in the way space was claimed and not offered, in the way my presence in a room would change its atmosphere in ways that had nothing to do with anything I did and everything to do with how he responded to my being there. He had never wanted me there. I understand that now. Charlotte had made this decision and he had agreed to it or failed to disagree firmly enough, and now he resented me for being the physical evidence of his failure to hold his ground. And that resentment grew. It grew through the summer and into the autumn. It grew through dinners eaten in pointed silence, and through mornings where greetings were not exchanged, and through afternoons where I would hear him talking to Charlotte in their bedroom in a voice too low to make out words, but with a tone I recognized from decades in courtrooms, the tone of someone building a case. He was building a case against me, against my presence, against my right to be there. The small insults came first. A comment about how much I ate, said lightly with a small laugh in a way that couldn't be called cruel without sounding oversensitive. A remark about my habits: I take long showers, I have always taken long showers. It was a running joke with Miriam for 4 decades, phrased as an inconvenience, a water bill problem, a logistical concern rather than what it actually was, which was contempt expressed through plumbing. He complained about my presence at their table when they had friends over. He began making plans that excluded me with no explanation. He began appropriating spaces I used, the small sitting room off the hallway where I kept my books and where I would read in the evenings, declaring it needed for other purposes without discussion or apology. Then the larger insults. He told me directly, one evening in the kitchen when Charlotte was out, that I needed to start thinking about a timeline, that he and Charlotte had sacrificed enough by having me there, that I needed to understand that this was his house and that he had been patient. I looked at him for a long moment. I had spent 32 years looking at people in courtrooms and assessing them clearly, and what I saw in Daniel Carr in that kitchen was not a man who had been patient. It was a man who had never once in his life faced real consequences for how he treated people. I told him calmly that I appreciated the house, that I was grateful for the arrangement, and that I was happy to discuss any concerns he had in a family conversation that included Charlotte. He didn't like that answer. He walked out of the kitchen without responding. The weeks that followed were the worst. The atmosphere in that house became something toxic and suffocating. Charlotte moved through it like a woman trying not to disturb a fault line, careful and quiet and willfully not seeing. My grandchildren, who were 7 and 9 and who I adored with my whole heart, seemed to feel the tension without understanding it. The older one, a boy named Peter, started asking me in the evenings why everyone seemed sad. I didn't know how to answer him. I still don't. I should have left. Looking back, I should have recognized that what was building in that house was not something that was going to resolve itself, and I should have made a dignified exit before it reached the point it reached. But I didn't, partly because of pride. I had given so much to that family, and leaving on those terms felt like being expelled from something I had helped build. Partly because of the children, I didn't want to disappear from their lives. And partly because of some stubborn insistence, deep in my chest, that Charlotte would eventually come back to herself, that the woman her mother had raised was still in there somewhere, and that she would not allow things to go further than they had already gone. I was wrong about that too. That afternoon, that grey, cold Tuesday afternoon, I was in the attic, doing what I had been doing for 3 days, sorting through boxes of my own belongings that I had moved up there when Daniel had reclaimed the sitting room. Books, mostly, a few photographs, the kind of things that seem small until you lose them. I heard him on the stairs. I heard his footsteps, heavy, deliberate, with the particular rhythm of someone who has been working themselves up to something. I had heard that rhythm before, in different settings, on the approach to a witness stand, on the approach to a sentencing decision, on the approach to a moment that cannot be taken back. He appeared in the attic doorway. His face was a mask of something I can only describe as having been clenched for a long time. Like every grievance he had decided to carry toward me, every perceived inconvenience, every moment he'd had to perform tolerance for my presence, every resentment he'd nursed, had all come to a boil at once, and had altered the actual structure of his face. He told me to get out. Not of the attic, not of the room, out of his house, out of his life. He called me worthless. He told me I was nothing. He used language I won't reproduce here, not because I'm protecting him, but because I refuse to give those words any more space than they've already taken up in my mind. I tried to speak. I tried to be reasonable. I tried, God help me, even in that moment, even facing that level of hostility, to find a path through it that didn't end in catastrophe. He didn't give me one. His hands slammed into my chest, and the world fell out from under me. I lay at the bottom of those stairs for what felt like a very long time, though it was probably less than a minute before I reached for my phone. In that minute, I experienced something I had never experienced before in 68 years of living. Complete abandonment. Not the quiet loneliness of losing a spouse, not the dull ache of estrangement or disappointment. Complete, explicit, witnessed abandonment. My daughter had looked down at me from the top of those stairs, had looked at my broken body and my grey face and my shaking hands, and had told someone to leave me there. In that minute, lying broken on that floor, I felt the full weight of what had been happening in that house pressed down on me all at once. Every moment I had explained away. Every insult I had absorbed. Every morning I had come down to that kitchen and tried to be cheerful and useful and unobtrusive. Every dinner I had eaten in silence rather than cause a scene. Every night I had lain in that guest room and told myself that Charlotte would come around, that things would improve, that the woman I'd raised was still fighting for me somewhere inside herself. All of it compressed into that single minute on that floor, and the weight of it was almost more than the physical pain. I reached into my pocket. I want to tell you about the number I dialed because I want you to understand what it represented. Over 32 years on the bench, I had built relationships with law enforcement, with prosecutors, with the entire apparatus of the criminal justice system in this state. I was known, I was respected. My word carried weight in rooms I was no longer present in. And the people who knew me, the people who had worked alongside me for decades, they took care of their own. The person I called that afternoon was someone I had known for over 20 years. A man who had risen through the ranks of law enforcement to a position of considerable authority. A man who had testified in my courtroom on multiple occasions and who had once told me, after a particularly difficult case, that I was the most fair judge he had ever appeared before. His name is not important. What is important is that when I whispered my name and my address into that phone, he did not ask me to verify my identity. He did not put me on hold. He did not transfer me to someone else. He said, "We're on our way." And 4 minutes later, sirens screamed outside the house. The officers who came through that front door were not strangers to me. 2 of them I recognized immediately, men who had appeared in my courtroom, men who had given testimony that I had weighed carefully and ruled on with as much fairness as I could bring to bear. They were good officers, experienced, the kind of officers who walk into a scene and read it in seconds, who don't need to be walked through the obvious. They read that scene in approximately 3 seconds. They saw me on the floor. They saw the angle of my wrist. They saw the way I was holding my ribs. They saw the blood from where my head had struck the railing. They saw the stairs behind me, the marks on the railing where my body had hit it, the evidence written plainly in the physical record of that stairwell. And then they looked up, and they saw Daniel Carr, standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms folded, wearing the expression of a man who had been rehearsing his innocence. And then, because they were experienced officers, and experienced officers look at everything, one of them looked at the far end of the hallway, and there was my daughter, standing with her back against the wall, not looking at me. I watched the older officer's face change when he recognized me. I watched the recognition move through him like a current, and I watched him turn to Daniel Carr, and I watched his professional composure, the careful, trained neutrality that good officers maintain in difficult situations, crack just slightly. "You did what?" Daniel Carr's arms unfolded. His practiced composure, the arrogance he had walked into that hallway with, the sense of control he had maintained by telling himself that this was his house, and he could do what he wanted in it, evaporated. In its place was something I had seen many times from the bench, the specific expression of a person who has just realized, for the first time and with absolute certainty, that what they have done has consequences they cannot outrun. Fear. Raw, cold, dawning fear. Let me tell you what happened in the hours and days that followed, because I want you to understand that justice is not always fast, but when it moves completely. I was taken to the hospital. The damage was significant but survivable: 2 cracked ribs, a hairline fracture in my left hip, a broken wrist, and a moderate concussion from where my head had struck the railing. They kept me overnight. They kept me 2 nights in the end because the concussion needed monitoring and because my blood pressure, understandably, was not where it should have been. I lay in that hospital bed and I stared at the ceiling and I processed. I processed the fact that my daughter had not come to the hospital. Not that first night, not the second night, not the morning I was discharged. I had spent 41 years loving Charlotte, had spent the last 11 of them loving her on behalf of her mother too, carrying that weight and that warmth forward through time, and she had not come to the hospital. I processed that. I also processed what was happening outside that hospital room. Because things were happening. The moment those officers had recognized me, a chain of events had been set in motion that Daniel Carr had no idea about and no capacity to stop. Phone calls had been made. The right people had been notified. The kind of attention that money can't buy and influence can't deflect had been directed at Daniel Carr and at what he had done to me. The arrest happened within 6 hours. Felony assault on an elderly person, which carries significantly enhanced penalties in this state, penalties I had applied myself from the bench on more than one occasion. The officers had documented the scene thoroughly. They had photographs. They had the testimony of neighbors who had heard the shouting. They had the medical records that were already being generated at the hospital. And they had me. They had a retired superior court judge who could describe, with clinical precision, exactly what had happened, who had the vocabulary, the composure, and the credibility to make a statement that would hold up under any scrutiny, who knew exactly what evidence mattered and how to ensure it was preserved. I gave my statement from my hospital bed. The detective who took it sat in the chair beside me and wrote down everything I said without a single interruption. I spoke slowly and clearly and completely. I described the confrontation. I described the physical contact. I described the fall. I described what Charlotte had said when she looked down at me. When I finished, the detective looked at his notepad for a moment. Then he looked at me. "Judge Lawson," he said, "this is as clear-cut as they come." Daniel Carr's arrogance had always had a specific quality that I had identified early, but had never fully named until I was lying in that hospital bed thinking about it. His arrogance was the arrogance of a man who had never once in his life faced real consequences. He had coasted on charm and confidence and the relative shelter of a comfortable life, and nothing had ever required him to reckon with what he actually was or what he was actually capable of. The people around him had always absorbed his worst behavior. His employers had promoted him despite the complaints that I later learned had been filed about him more than once. His friends had overlooked the incidents that should have given them pause. And Charlotte had covered for him, managed around him, explained him away, loved him in the way that some people love, by endlessly accommodating what the person they love does to them and to others. And I had not pushed back with the force I should have. I had absorbed it. I had been patient and diplomatic and had chosen the family peace over the dignity I was owed because I was afraid of losing Charlotte, because I could not afford to lose her too. And Daniel had interpreted my patience as weakness. He had confused my restraint for inability. He had looked at a 68-year-old man who moved carefully and spoke quietly and didn't raise his voice, and he had decided that what he was seeing was powerlessness. He had decided that I was harmless, that I was finished, that whatever I had once been had already passed, and what remained was just an old man in the way. This is the most profound and costly mistake he ever made. Because what I had been, what I am, does not dissolve when you retire. The career was over. The bench was behind me, but the network of relationships built over 32 years, the respect earned through 32 years of rigorous, fair, committed jurisprudence, the knowledge of how the criminal justice system works and what it does to people who assault elderly men in their own homes, all of that was intact. And all of it was now pointed directly at Daniel Carr. His professional life collapsed first. His employer, a financial services firm where he held a position of some responsibility, was not prepared for the press attention that followed the arrest. The local paper ran the story. It was picked up by 2 regional outlets. Son-in-law assaults retired Superior Court judge, faces felony charges, is the kind of headline that spreads. He was placed on administrative leave within 48 hours of the arrest. Within 2 weeks, he had resigned or been encouraged to resign in terms that left him no alternative. The position he had held, the salary that had funded the lifestyle he'd built, the professional identity that was the only identity he truly valued, gone. And I want you to understand what that meant for a man like Daniel Carr, because professional identity was not incidental to who he was. It was load-bearing. He had organized his sense of self around what he did and what he earned and the particular status that his job conferred, and without it, he was left standing in the ruins of a self that had no other structural supports. He had never developed any. He had never needed to. He had been coasting on charm and income for so long that he had never bothered to build anything underneath. His financial situation deteriorated rapidly from there. The legal costs were immediate and substantial. A criminal defense of the kind he required, given the evidence, given who the victim was, given the enhanced charges, does not come cheap. He had been living at the edge of his means for years, as I well knew. The mortgage arrears I'd covered had not been an anomaly, but an indicator. Without his income, and with significant legal fees accumulating, the financial architecture of his life began to come apart. First, the discretionary things, the restaurants, the vacations, the expensive habits, then the structural things, the insurance policies that lapsed, the savings accounts that drained, the credit cards that filled up with legal expenses and were then not paid. The mortgage fell behind again. There was no retired judge to call this time. His social world, the friends, the connections, the social currency he had accumulated through charm and performance, reacted to the news of the arrest the way such worlds always react, with rapid, almost elegant withdrawal. The dinner parties stopped. The invitations dried up. The colleagues who had liked him discovered they had other commitments when he called. The particular cruelty of that kind of social collapse is that it happens so quietly, so efficiently, with so little drama that it almost looks voluntary, like he had simply decided to disappear. He hadn't decided anything. He was being erased. And in the quiet of that erasure, I wonder if he had moments, in the evenings alone, without the professional identity and the social calendar and the income that had previously filled all the hours, where he thought about what he had done, not just the act itself, not just the hands on my chest and the sound of my body on those stairs, but the years before it, the daily, habitual, comfortable cruelty he had practiced toward a man who had never done him any harm. Whether in those quiet hours, stripped of everything that had allowed him to feel superior and safe, he was able to look clearly at himself. I don't know the answer to that question. I have made my peace with not knowing. The criminal proceedings moved forward. I won't pretend they were swift. Nothing in the legal system is swift, but they were thorough. The prosecution was handled by people I knew professionally, people who understood exactly what the charges meant and what the evidence supported, and who prosecuted accordingly. I was present for several of the hearings. I did not need to be present. My statement was in the record. My medical evidence was comprehensive, but I chose to be present, not out of vengeance, not to watch him suffer, but because 32 years of sitting on that bench had taught me that justice is not just a transaction that occurs in paperwork. It is a witnessed event, and the victims of violence deserve to be present when it is adjudicated. I sat in that courtroom in a suit I had worn on other occasions, funerals, mostly formal occasions, the occasions of permanence, and I watched the proceedings with the detachment of a man who had watched hundreds of them. I noted the quality of the defense's arguments. I noted the strength of the prosecution's evidence. I noted, more than anything else, Daniel Carr's demeanor as the proceedings advanced, and the reality of his situation became increasingly impossible to deny. He had started with defiance. He had come into those early hearings with his jaw set and his lawyer beside him and his eyes hard with a residual arrogance that I found almost impressive in its stubbornness. He still thought, at some level, that he was going to find a way through this, that something would break in his favor, that the system would extend him a mercy he had not extended to me. The system did not extend him that mercy. As the weeks passed and the evidence accumulated and the hearings continued, I watched the defiance drain out of him. I watched his posture change. I watched his face change. I watched the man who had stood over me in that attic doorway with his hands full of contempt become, hearing by hearing, something smaller and more afraid than he had ever imagined he could be. He had made his catastrophic mistake. And now he was living in it. I want to be honest with you about Charlotte, about what happened between us, because it is the part of this story that costs me the most to tell, and that I am most uncertain how to resolve, even now, even with everything that has since occurred. She called me, eventually, 3 weeks after the incident. I was staying at the house of an old friend, a colleague from the bench, who had insisted I come to stay while I recovered, whose wife had fed me soup and made me rest, and had treated me with a simple, uncomplicated decency that I was deeply grateful for. Charlotte called me on a Tuesday evening, the 3-week anniversary of what had happened, and when I answered the phone, her voice was very small. She said she was sorry. I listened, I let her say it. She said she didn't know why she had stood there. She said she had been afraid. She said that life with Daniel had been difficult in ways she had been hiding from me, had been hiding from herself for a long time, and that when it happened, she had frozen, and that she would live with that forever. I listened to all of it. I told her that I loved her. I told her that I had always loved her and that I would always love her, because she was my daughter, and she was all I had left of Miriam, and love of that kind does not have an off switch. I told her that what she had said, leave him there, no one cares, had wounded me in a place I didn't know could be wounded at my age, and that it was going to take time. Real time, not an apology's worth of time. She wept. I listened to her weep. I told her I was not going to tell her what to do with her marriage or her life or her relationship with Daniel, because she was a grown woman and those were her decisions. But I told her something her mother used to say to her when she was small. The truest test of a person's character is how they treat people who have no power over them. There was a long silence. Then she said, I know, Dad, I know. I'm not a man who wanted this outcome. I want to be very clear about that, because there is a version of this story, a simpler, less truthful version, where the injured party is righteous and certain and filled with clean, satisfying anger, where the justice achieved is exactly proportional to the harm suffered, where nothing is lost that shouldn't have been lost, and where the man who was thrown down the stairs gets exactly what he wanted from the beginning, and the villain gets nothing but what he deserved. That is not quite the story I have lived. The justice was real. Daniel Carr was prosecuted and convicted. He lost his freedom for a period, not as long as I might have handed down from the bench for the same charges, but long enough to make the permanence of his consequences real. He lost his career. He lost his house, eventually. He lost the social world he had built. He lost the marriage, ultimately, though that particular loss I will not elaborate on because Charlotte's decision is her own. All of that is real. All of that happened. But I also lost something. I lost the version of my family I had been holding onto. I lost the version of Charlotte I had believed in, and while I believe she is finding her way back toward herself, toward the woman her mother raised, that process is long and uncertain, and I am watching it from a distance with a mixture of hope and grief that I don't have precise language for. I lost time with my grandchildren that I cannot recover. I lost 8 months of living in that house, 8 months of quiet daily hurt that I absorbed when I should have refused it. And I lost something more abstract, but no less real, the belief that having given everything you have to the people you love is sufficient protection against being treated as though you are nothing. It is not sufficient protection, I know that now. There are things I have learned from this. At 68 years old, lying in a hospital bed with cracked ribs and a broken wrist, and a concussion, staring at a ceiling I did not recognize. I have learned that love without dignity is not love, it is accommodation. And accommodation, endlessly extended to people who exploit it, becomes its own kind of trap. I have learned that silence in the face of escalating disrespect is not peace. It is only the postponement of a confrontation, and the longer it is postponed, the more violent the confrontation becomes when it finally arrives. I have learned that the powerful and the powerless are not as fixed in their categories as they appear. Daniel Carr thought he was powerful in that house. He thought I was powerless. He had the keys and the deed and the youth and the physical strength, and I was a 68-year-old man who moved carefully and didn't raise his voice. He looked at all of that and calculated, with the confidence of a man who has never been wrong about such things, that he could do what he wanted to me. He was wrong in a way that cost him everything he valued. I have learned, though I knew this already, had known it from the bench, that dignity is not something that can be taken from a person by force. It can be wounded. It can be attacked. A man can throw you down a flight of stairs and lie at the bottom of them feeling smaller than you have ever felt. But dignity is not the absence of hurt. It is what remains after the hurt. It is the voice that whispers into a phone to the right person at the right moment, even when every other system in your body is failing. I have learned that there is a difference between the power you hold formally, the robe, the bench, the gavel, the institutional authority, and the power you hold in yourself. The formal power I gave up when I retired. The power in myself, the network, the knowledge, the relationships, the clarity of mind under pressure that I have not given up and do not intend to. As I lay there at the bottom of those stairs, surrounded by friends who had shown up without being asked, watched over by officers who recognized me and were furious on my behalf, waiting for the ambulance I had summoned with the one call I had left in me, I realized something that I have been thinking about ever since. I was never weak. I want to say that again because it matters. Because for months, living in that house, absorbing the insults and the coldness and the escalating contempt, some part of me had begun to believe the story Daniel was telling about me, that I was past my usefulness, that I was a burden, that my age had diminished me in some fundamental way that made his treatment of me, if not acceptable, then at least understandable. I had begun to believe it. And lying there on that floor, I stopped. I was never weak. I was never powerless. I was never merely an old man in someone else's way. I was simply silent. I had chosen silence as a courtesy, as a strategy, as an act of love toward a daughter I didn't want to force into an impossible position. I had chosen restraint as a value, as a discipline, as the thing that had made me a good judge for 32 years. I had chosen patience because I am, at my core, a patient man, and because I believed that patience would eventually be rewarded. It was not rewarded, and so I stopped being silent. One call, one number, one moment of clarity at the bottom of those stairs when my body was failing and my heart was broken and my daughter had turned away. But my mind was still precise, still disciplined, still the mind that had sat on that bench for 32 years and understood exactly how the machinery of justice works and how to set it in motion. That was not weakness revealing itself under pressure. That was strength that had been waiting quietly for the moment it was needed. And it was, as it turned out, more than sufficient. I am back in my own home now, not the large house I sold. I wasn't ready to return to that, but a smaller place, a good place, with a garden I am learning and neighbors who wave at me in the mornings. My wrist has healed almost completely. The ribs took longer. Ribs always take longer than you want them to, but they healed. The hip is managed with exercise and care. The concussion's effects faded in time. I read in the evenings. I tend my garden in the mornings when the weather permits. I have dinner once a week with the friend who took me in after the hospital, and his wife makes a soup that I have decided is one of the finer soups I have ever encountered in a life that has included some very good soup. I speak to Charlotte. We are careful with each other, which is not what we were before and not what I hope we will be eventually, but it is honest, and for now honest is what we have, and it is enough. I have not spoken to Daniel Carr. I have nothing to say to him. I said everything I had to say in a statement I gave from a hospital bed, and the judicial system said the rest on my behalf, and that is a complete and sufficient conversation. My grandchildren call me. Peter, who is 10 now, calls me on Sunday mornings. He tells me about his week at school and about the football team he joined and about a book he is reading that he thinks I might like. He is right, I probably would like it. I tell him that, he laughs. That laugh, that easy, uncomplicated, morning sunlight laugh of a 10-year-old boy who loves his grandfather, is worth more to me than anything that happened in that courtroom. It is worth more than the conviction, more than the consequences, more than the justice. It is the thing that remains, the thing they could not take. I said at the beginning of this story that I am not a man who dramatizes. Let me close with the truth, which requires no dramatization at all. They thought throwing me down the stairs would end my life. Perhaps not literally end it. Perhaps even in that moment of rage Daniel Carr wasn't thinking about literal death, but end it in the way that truly matters, end my dignity, end my relevance, end whatever claim I had to being treated as a human being worthy of basic decency. But instead, it ended his. Not because I am special, not because I had some unique access to justice that ordinary people don't have, though I will acknowledge, honestly and without false modesty, that the relationships I had built over 32 years accelerated what might otherwise have taken longer. But because there is a principle at work here that does not depend on who I am specifically or what I had built specifically. The principle is this: disrespecting the wrong man comes with consequences you can never escape. And the wrong man is not necessarily a retired judge with connections to law enforcement. The wrong man is any man who reaches the point where he stops absorbing the disrespect being aimed at him, who reaches the bottom of the stairs, broken and in pain, and still has the clarity and the will and the presence of mind to act, who refuses, even then, even in that extremity, to accept the story being told about him by the people who pushed him. Every person lying broken somewhere, physically or metaphorically, has a phone in their pocket, has a number they haven't dialed yet, has a choice between absorbing one more act of cruelty in silence and deciding, finally, that silence was never the right answer. I dialed my number. I urge you to know yours. Because dignity, once you decide to defend it, is a formidable thing, and the people who mistake your patience for powerlessness, who mistake your restraint for inability, who mistake your silence for permission, they have no idea what they are about to set in motion. They didn't know what I had in my pocket. They didn't know who I was. They found out. And that is the most complete kind of justice there is. Not the revenge you plan, but the truth that was always there, waiting quietly for the moment it was finally allowed to speak. My name is Edward Lawson. I am 68 years old, and I am still standing.